Last time we were together, we concluded a study of the Gospel of Luke, and so now we're jumping into. It's been quite some time since we've had a history of introduction or an introduction to independent Catholicism. What it is that makes us unique as persons who are deeply Catholic, but who don't self-identify with the Roman Catholic Church, the largest expression of Catholicism in our world at present. And so the question naturally arises, if we're going to study independent Catholicism, and I just want to preface this by saying that I'm working on this sort of as a book project. So I'm thinking of publishing this one day in book form. So I welcome all questions that you have, because it helps me to think through what it is that I'm presenting, but also how it is that people respond to what it is that they're hearing and reading. So if we're going to study independent Catholicism, the question becomes, where or how do we study this thing that we call independent Catholicism? Do we focus on contemporary expressions of it now in the 21st century, on our expressions, our communities, our beliefs, our practices? Do we step back in time with various schisms that occurred throughout history? You know, some of the more significant schisms that have occurred with respect to independent Catholicism include the 1870 Vatican Council, because it was at this council that the Roman Catholic Church, its leaders, pushed through this idea of papal infallibility and universal jurisdiction of the Pope, meaning the Pope is over the whole church. That idea is from 1870. Right? Do we go back to then, when dissenting theologians said, oh, we are deeply Catholic, but we can no longer self-identify with what's happening in the Roman Catholic Church? Do we step back even farther? Do you remember what we celebrated last year? Last year was the 300th anniversary of a significant event in independent Catholicism. That was the consecration of the Archbishop of Utrecht by a Roman Catholic bishop, Dominique Marie Varlet, when he stopped through Amsterdam and consecrated another bishop without the Vatican's approval. The Vatican now had a problem, because there was a validly consecrated bishop now up in the Netherlands who was consecrated without the permission of Rome. That's a significant date that we often look to. Do we go to other divides in the church? Do you remember, for instance, there was a significant divide in the church in 1517? Who started that divide in the church? A Roman Catholic priest. His name was Father Martin Luther. Do you remember his story? He's the one who wrote up a list of 95 questions that he had for his church, including things like indulgences. How can we as human beings claim to allow people to buy time out of purgatory? What gives me as a priest the ability to be able to sell time out of purgatory? So most historians would back up a history of Catholicism, say, to the events related to Jesus of Nazareth around the beginning of the first millennium, and the Judeo-Christian context in which he lived. But as independent Catholics, I would like to suggest that we begin our study even before then. In the same way that the Gospels come and have different starting points for the story of Jesus, where does Mark begin his story of Jesus? His Gospel begins with which event? Mark begins with Jesus's baptism as an adult, right? Then the next ones to be written are Matthew and then Luke. Where did they start their stories of Jesus? With Jesus's birth and the events leading up to Jesus's birth, like his conception. John is the last gospel to be written. And where does John begin his story of Jesus?
Hologos.
Which in English means?
In the beginning.
In the beginning. Do you remember those famous words from John? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John roots his gospel with Jesus existing from the very... Jesus wasn't just Jesus from the moment of his baptism. He wasn't just Jesus from the moment of his conception and or birth. He was Jesus since the beginning of time. In the beginning was the Word, Christ, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He begins all the way at the beginning of time. So I'm going to propose something a little unorthodox here, that we begin our study of independent Catholicism in the beginning of time. I'm not the first person to suggest that we do this. In fact, in 1912, there was a catechism written by Gregorio Aglipay Ilabayan, who is the Supreme Bishop of the Philippine Independent Church, or in Spanish, the Iglesia Filipina Independiente in the Philippines. And in 1912, they wrote a catechism that read more like a science book. Because now, remember, after the 1902 revolution in the Philippines, the US came into the Philippines, took over the Philippines as a territory, and in order to buck the colonialism that they felt was imposed on them by the Spanish, and then after that by the United States, the Philippine church seceded from the Roman Catholic Church and formed a new church, what they refer to as the Iglesia Filipina Independiente, or in English, the Philippine Independent Church. It's the largest independent Catholic church in the world, with some 6 to 8 million people. 6 to 8 million people in the Philippines are like us here at Holy Family and other communities throughout the United States, where they self-identify as deeply Catholic, but not as Roman Catholic. And so, go ahead, Adrian, please.
In the Philippines, there's still Roman Catholicism.
Mm-hmm.
Still.
Mm-hmm. So probably about, I'm guessing some 80 million people in the Philippines are Roman Catholic. And then some 6 to 8 million people in the Philippines are independent Catholic. They would say that they're members of the Iglesia Filipina Independiente, or the other phrase that we hear is that they refer to themselves as Aglipayans, as followers of Gregorio Aglipay, who was the first Supreme Bishop who wrote this catechism in 1912, Gregorio Aglipay. I was just this weekend from a friend from the Philippines. And every time I was somewhere in the Philippines, I love talking with them, because I say, oh, I've never been to the Philippines. I've written 6 books on the Philippines now, and I haven't been to the Philippines yet. Oh, what have you written? What have you written on in the Philippines? I say, I write on a church called the Iglesia Filipina Independiente, and inevitably they respond and they say, oh yeah, that's a sect. What that tells me immediately is, 1, that they're Roman Catholic, and 2, that they've given into this Roman Catholic brainwashing of how it is that they are the only true Catholics, and anyone outside of their church, it's this in-group, out-group mentality, right? If you're not part of us, then you're part of them. You're a sect. Adrian.
But wasn't this the more nationalistic after the Spanish-American War?
Very much so.
And was there a correlation with Marcos?
Yes, there is. You're getting into some dark history. So first of all, the tie to nationalism. The Philippine Independent Church is a very nationalist church, simply meaning we are proud to be Filipinos. Mm-hmm. What was happening was that the Roman Catholic Church did not allow Filipinos to be priests in their church. So all of these Spanish colonizers came over, and the Spanish were the ones who were in charge of the church, and it was your job, Filipinos, to pay, pray, and obey. They rose up, they organized. Eventually, there were Filipino priests in the church, but they still didn't have the same rights in the church. And so with the Philippine Revolution in 1902, when Gregorio Aglipay and others broke away from the Roman Catholic Church, they decided they were going to be a deeply Filipino church. We're not going to be like the church of the colonizers here in the archipelago. We are going to be a different church. We are going to be proud to be Filipino. Which means that, for instance, even today, you'll see many times when they have like special celebrations, They'll dress in the colors of their national flag, which we wouldn't think of here in the United States, but it would be the equivalent of Father Jamie coming in not dressed in green vestments, but instead in red, white, and blue vestments. Now, the Filipino flag is a very simple red, white, and blue flag. So often their vestments are like half white and half red with like a blue part around the neck. It's not obviously the Filipino flag, but for Filipinos who see those colors, it inspires this sense of pride or nationalism. So it is a very nationalist church. Now, Adrian is opening up a can of worms by mentioning a name. What name did you mention? Marcos?
Fernando Marcos.
Fernando Marcos. Has anyone heard of Fernando Marcos before? He married a woman whose name was Imelda Marcos, right? Who was known for like having a huge shoe collection.
Right.
The two of them are known in history as being like the most corrupt world leaders ever.
Yeah.
The story is that Imelda Marcos was a good Roman Catholic, but she married an Aglapayan whose name was Fernando. And so that dark history of the Fernando Marcos dictatorship does have a relationship to the IFI insofar as he was raised an Aglapayan. So the Aglapayan Church had a very strong hold in the Philippines and was a very nationalist church. So it was natural that a leader was going to come out of that independent Catholic Church. Unfortunately, he was not the best model that we could have had out of the Philippines. But we've had other great Aglapayans serve in the Filipino government. The first president of the Philippines, Emiliano Aguinaldo, was an Aglapayan. He was not Roman Catholic. He, like all these other early ones, broke from the Roman Catholic Church.
The current president is son of Fernando and Imelda. Right?
Oh, okay. So what I do know is that Fernando did, so in order for us to disown him, we'll tell the story here. When he got married, one of the conditions for him marrying Imelda was that he had to convert to the Roman Catholic Church. So I guess that's one way in which we could be like Pontius Pilate and wash our hands of the evil doing of that regime by saying he was Roman Catholic by the time that he committed all those atrocities. Rich, fascinating history. For the purposes of our study, what I'd like to bring to our attention is that already in 1912, 113 years ago, when they wrote their Catechism of the Philippine Independent Church, if you were to read it today, and if I had time, I would translate it from Spanish to English, except that it's outdated science by now because it was written in 1912. Mm-hmm. But it was their attempt in 1912 to read contemporary science and to understand their church in light of science, beginning in the beginning. So he talks about the Big Bang and evolution and the evolution of world religions and all these other things that I don't know about you, but growing up in the Roman Catholic Church, we didn't have that as part of our story. Our story was simply Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden after God created the world in 7 days. What I would dare to suggest is that we as independent Catholics, we can continue to tell those stories because those stories are part of our Judeo-Christian heritage. They're stories that are part of our scriptures, but also there's something beautiful about us not being afraid to look toward science and to be able to see how it is that science and religion give us different stories, and they need not necessarily be in conflict, which is what we were discussing before we went on break. That is to say, sometimes we've had this view that religion and science, they tell two different things and they can't both be right. So who's right and who's wrong? And the church has always said, who's right? We're right.
The creation.
Creationism is one word. So one of the debates, for instance, is creationism versus what?
Evolution.
Evolution. Let's make sure that we're understanding these words. What is creationism and what is evolution? Easiest one first. What is evolution? Evolution is the belief that we
Evolved.
Evolved from what? From other
Apes.
forms, from other life forms, right?
Yeah.
That we weren't always standing on 2 feet as we are today. Evolution suggests, and there are very popular pictures showing a human being standing up on this side of the chart, going back to other things that are crawling on 4 legs that eventually became more upright like we are today. That's evolution, that we somehow evolved over time. That's not the story that the Bible tells. Because when the Bible was written, we didn't believe in evolution yet. When did the belief in evolution arise? In the 19th century. Yeah, the 1800s. Darwin, Charles Darwin. So this is a relatively new belief, which is part of the reason why Gregorio Aglipai and all of his friends were so eager to embrace it, because the world of science was telling us something about ourselves. That there is a possibility that the world was not created by God in 7 days, literally, but instead there was this event at the beginning of time. Let's call it the Big Bang, and that the universe has been evolving ever since, and we are at the height of this evolution. We are the highest that we have ever been in this evolution. And our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren are going to keep evolving beyond us. So we're living in exciting times, said the Aglipaians in 1912, when they were writing their catechism, which reads more like a science textbook than a catechism. That's evolution. What is creationism? Creationism is espoused by those who read the scriptures more literally. So if the scriptures say that God created the world in 7 days, then what happened? God created the world in 7 days. And if we understand a day to be 24 hours, then that means that God created the world and rested all within 168 hours. 7 24-hour days. Do you see we're now suddenly we have 2 different stories? And they can't both be true. Or can they? That is, from the perspective of science, science is giving us one truth, one story, one way of looking at our origin. And our ancient ancestors, who didn't have access to that science, gave us another way of looking at our origins. All societies have origin stories, or creation myths, if you will. Every ancient society had its Grandpa Rudy, who told stories around the campfire, and when we asked them, where did we come from, we had an answer. Indigenous tribes in what today is the United States of America had their creation stories, right? Oh, that we were made by these grain gods, or by this young man smacked his sister with a fish and she started multiplying, whatever the creation stories were. There were all sorts of creation, and I didn't make that up. That was actually one of the indigenous stories here in the United States. There were various creation stories that the Grandpa Rudies of the world used to explain to their kids and grandkids and great-grandkids where we came from. So these stories, creation in 7 days and evolution, are 2 stories that can't fit together. Or can they? Especially if we understand that they're different stories from different time periods by different people with different understandings. Evolution is from people of the 19th century who had one understanding of where we come from. Creationism was from people of another time period, some 2,500 years ago, for whom this earth was a very different thing. They didn't believe in a circular earth that went around the sun. At that point, the earth was flat with a bowl above it, and the sun and the moon both went across that bowl. Let's pause there for any questions, comments. Mario?
Father Jamie, I believe in some evolution. I mean, very intelligent people create other things. Well, when I was in college, we had evolution, and the fish came out and
Fish
they
came out of the
developed
water.
legs, you know.
Yeah,
and,
became
and
lizard. Right.
they developed
frog.
legs, and hearing and everything else. Uh, they came out of the water in the ocean. I mean, that's that's facts way behind, um, and people have evolved.
And our thinking has evolved. Our stories have evolved. I think that's the important thing for us to take away from it, right? Our ancient ancestors, Grandpa Rudy, 2,500 years ago, had one story around the campfire. People have told other stories in other cultures and other places and in other times. And now we're living in the 21st century where, like it or not, our grandkids and great grandkids are going to hear a different origin story in addition to the Adam and Eve story that we'll continue to tell them. And so they'll probably not take Adam and Eve so literally, because many of them are seeing images that come from outer space, looking down on the earth and seeing a round earth that goes around the sun. They're seeing the world in a very different way than what our ancient ancestors saw the world.
Are we good? We're getting, we're going to the moon, and we're getting so much intelligence. Before, I didn't have a cell phone back then.
Yeah. And now your cell phone has more technology inside of it than the spacecraft that we sent up to the moon in the when was that, 60s?
Yep.
So to continue this, why are we starting in the beginning with this history of independent Catholicism? Father Jamie, couldn't we start like closer to the 21st century? Because what becomes fascinating is that all those years that I was a Roman Catholic priest, we couldn't talk about science in the same way because, frankly, I was living within an institution where, in order to hold on to power, it condemned science in many places and in many points. It condemned modernism in the 1860s and 1860s and 1860s and 50s and 60s, leading up to the First Vatican Council. The Pope condemned modernism, saying, "Don't believe what science tells you to believe. Believe what I, the Pope, say." The same Pope who condemned modernism is the same Pope that had himself named infallible. And is the same Pope that said Mary was conceived without sin. Believe me because I said it, and it's infallible. I cannot be wrong. The ancient church would have condemned that as a heresy. What heresy is that? To say that I know something that you don't know because God whispered in my ear? It's Gnosticism. Gnosticism is the belief that someone has a certain knowledge, gnosis, and that's essentially what happened to the First Vatican Council in 1870 was the Pope was proclaimed Gnostic. And the Roman Catholic Church fell into the heresy of Gnosticism again.
But the only challenge is contemporarily this day is that the current Roman Catholic Pope believes more in the evolutionary side.
There you go. Pope Francis, who knows how much longer we'll have him, and where we'll go after that. But before Pope Francis, the pendulum had swung in the direction of two very conservative popes who were taking the church backward in time, John Paul II and Benedict XVI, who talked about a reform of undoing the reforms of the Second Vatican Council. With Pope Francis, the pendulum has swung into a more progressive pope who has dared to say, "Who am I to judge LGBTQIA siblings?" Right? Who's been much more open on various issues, like those who are divorced receiving communion, as if Jesus would eat with sinners. So the church keeps swinging. Right now, the Roman Catholic Church has swung to a very progressive pope, but he is the head of a very large system. So he has to toe a certain party line, because if he doesn't, that's going to lead to the fracture of his church. It's going to lead to another schism. After he was elected and started saying things like that, there was talk about a possible schism in the Roman Catholic Church between those who are more conservative and those who were embracing what was Pope Francis's first book called? Do you remember when he wrote his first book? This is some 12 years ago. His book was called "The Name of God is Mercy." hear how that fits with this coming Sunday's gospel? The name of God is mercy, not judgment. So maybe we as independent Catholics can sort of like open our minds a bit just to see how it is that faith and science need not be in conflict. It's not one or the other. They're different stories told by different people in different time periods, rooted in what is they believe. Creationism has its place, and for our ancient ancestors, it was the way that they understood the world. Grandpa Rudy had to explain to the kids and grandkids where we came from, and so he told it in terms of God creating the world in 6 days. Thank you, Grandpa Rudy. That was a beautiful thing that you did to help them to understand where we came from in light of what we knew back then. Nearly 2,500 years later, Darwin had another origin story, and others who started talking about things like a Big Bang, which is why when Aglapai starts talking about a Big Bang and evolution in his catechism, it perks up our ears like, why are we talking about this in a Bible study? Why are we talking about it in Bible study? Because what becomes fascinating is when we start understanding ourselves and our religion in the context of science and of evolution. Because what's going to happen is we're going to see how it is that Catholicism evolves from Christianity, which evolves from Judaism, which evolves from other ancient religions and ancient expressions.
Evolution.
And so if we're going to understand who we are today and why we do some of the things that we do, things like lighting candles and burning incense and eating Christ's body and blood, you can't just understand it in the context of 2021. All of these things have ancient roots.
And that in itself has evolved over time.
Yeah.
Not because of creationism, but because of the institutional aspect of keeping the power
Yeah.
in the status quo.
Yeah. All those practices are going to evolve in light of so many factors.
Nationalism.
Nationalism now.
States,
Globalization now. We are so connected with everyone from throughout the world that we're living in a different world than when I was a child. When I was a child, China seemed like such a far place away. Now you can get on a plane, you can be in China in 12 hours. And our kids and grandkids, and maybe even some of us, are going off and exploring some of those places in the world.
And there are a million of Catholics in China that we don't know about.
So maybe as independent Catholics, we need not be afraid of science in the same way that others were. I mean, imagine for a moment the Roman Catholic Church condemning Galileo and other scientists throughout history, condemning modernism, condemning anyone who had a progressive idea because it didn't fit with the model that they were trying to hold up. As independent Catholics, then, we are a religious movement, number 12, that is not afraid of science, and instead helps us to understand our origins in a slightly different light. We're going to understand, as part of this study, first of all, the origins of religion. Where does religion come from? Who are the first people to be religious, and how did that show itself? The origins of the Judeo-Christian religion. Where did the Jewish religion come from? Where did the Christian religion come from? Because I have a feeling they're both connected, if indeed Jesus was a Jew. What are the origins of various schisms within Christianity? Because independent Catholicism was not the first division in the church. We're going to hear about other divisions in the church, like that excommunication of the Roman Catholic Church in 1054 that we've talked about before. Like that division in the church in 1517 when Father Martin Luther asked questions about his church. I'm going to put that other date up here because 1054 is such a significant date, because that's when the Eastern Church excommunicated the Roman Catholic Church. That's when the Roman Catholic Church first became the Roman Catholic Church. It was excommunicated from the rest of the Orthodox or right-believing church. We'll get to that a little later. And we'll talk about this specific religious and sociological movement that is independent Catholicism today, because let's just be honest, independent Catholicism is not a church in the same way that the Roman Catholic Church is a church. The Roman Catholic Church has this worldwide structure that we don't have. We don't have a pope in independent Catholicism. Follow me? When we had our first gathering in 2019, they were joking about Pope Jamie. Yeah, there is no pope in the Independent Catholic Church, because what we have is more akin to a sociological movement where we have small communities in different places who are all taking a look at this system, this Roman Catholic system, and each has its own unique history of how it divided and why, like the Philippine Independent Church and how it divided and why it divided from the Roman Catholic Church, like Holy Family Catholic Church in Austin, Texas, why it divided from the Roman Catholic Church and why it divided, and so many other communities throughout the United States and throughout the world who have their unique history but haven't yet come together to form a meta church, an organization over all of them.
Brother Jamie, the invention of computers started way back then. They told the custodian was cleaning the office, and they decided to. Some students decided to label things instead of the government having all kinds of messes and all that. So they label things. That's why we have computers now and iPhones and everything else. So they were very bright. That was at MIT a long time ago, back in the 30s or 40s or 50s. They started the computer. So now you have to have a password. You have to have a password to get into something.
What I'm hearing is that even technology is evolving. How many of us have a cell phone today? And how many of our cell phones are like the cell phone that you had 20 years ago? Do you remember the first cell phone that you had?
Yeah, it was huge.
Think for a moment of how it is that your cell phone has changed. I remember the first phone that I got that was not a home phone on a wall was a car phone in 1996. It was like a big old box that plugged into the cigarette charger. And then I remember getting my first flip phone in 2000. And just think of how it is that our technology has evolved. If our technology has evolved, but our knowledge of God and our faith has not, at some point we're going to come to this conflict, because we have a faith that's back here somewhere and this other knowledge base that keeps continuing. And our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren find themselves here abandoning our faith because it no longer makes sense to them. They're calling themselves nuns, spelled Nones, meaning they have no religion. What's your religion? None. Because they're with this view of the world that keeps progressing while our religion stays back here. And maybe, just maybe, if we had a religion that somehow helped to make sense of the world and the world of our religion, then I'm wondering if there wouldn't be more young people today who would be eager to embrace ideas, except that their churches are telling them that the ideas of this world are not to be espoused, right? What do you do with a church that says you are not to believe science or modernism? Believe what I tell you to believe, because I'm infallible. Crazy, huh?
So evolution certainly has its place in history.
Uh-huh.
What does the Roman Catholic Church do with the information that God's time is not our time, and how that would fit in with evolution?
Yeah, it definitely would. Really, the only challenge here is one of how literally or not do we read stories like this. If this is God's word, Genesis chapters 1 and 2, if this is God's word, then this is how it happened. Okay, how literally do we believe that? And or is it possible that is how our ancient ancestors understood it, but our views of the world have evolved since then?
The problem or the challenge, in my opinion, is you've placed those two extremes into politics.
That is a problem. So, Adrian, I think you're like pulling back the Band-Aid on a real truth here, because in politics we have certain progressive voices that esteem certain values, like the equality of certain peoples, regardless of their race or of their gender. Right? If a man has agency over his body, then shouldn't a woman have agency over her body? That's a progressive stand. And then you have others who are more conservative in their stances. And you have to ask yourself, why do people hold on to various stances? A lot of it has to do with power and control. It is easier for me to control women if I tell them that I have power over their bodies and they do not. Dang. That sounded a little harsh. Right now, we have the peeling back of DEI, an acronym for diversity, equity, and inclusion. We've done all sorts of things since the 1950s and 60s to help to give a hand up to people who are historically disadvantaged. And now it's sort of like we are trying to do away with that and say that we're creating a merit-based society, as if anyone in the current administration's cabinet were there because of merit. There's a certain irony there. But political commentary aside, I want to apologize in advance, because if we are to look at our faith through a different lens, this may cause some cognitive dissonance, a fancy word for how it is that we learn certain things, and then when you hear something that goes against that, then it sort of like creates something in your mind that's like, there's just something not right about that. Follow me? And so when you hear the story of Adam and Eve all these years as a child, and then you hear someone tell you about evolution, you're like, there's just something about that it doesn't fit with what I know. What I know is that God created the world in 6 days, and God created Adam and Eve as the first people. And now you're telling me something different? Follow me? That's cognitive dissonance. So I just want to pause and acknowledge up front that anything that we're hearing from now on tonight could cause a little cognitive dissonance, because it may be the first time that you're hearing it, and or the first time that you're thinking about it, and or the first time that you're starting to see our faith through slightly different lenses, and that's okay. Cognitive dissonance is just something that we sort of work through. Can you think of other examples of cognitive dissonance in your life where you thought one thing and then suddenly something happened, you heard something, you learned something, and it's sort of like it rocked your world? I'm watching a series right now called White Lotus. Anybody seen White Lotus? Right? There are different people in there who are having relationships outside of their relationship, and when their partner finds out about it, they thought that their partner was faithful to them, and then when they learn that they haven't been, what does that do? That creates cognitive dissonance. Yikes, what do I do with this? I thought that my partner was faithful. Creates cognitive dissonance. Because what I believed is no longer the case, so how do I fit what I know now with what I used to believe? Cognitive dissonance. It's, as I suggest in point number 13, human beings tend to prefer the black and white over so many shades of gray. So when Grandpa Rudy gives us all these fantastic stories that talk about a very simple world and simple creation, we tend to believe these things, and then when we hear something different, it sort of rocks us a little, right? Grandpa Rudy told me about God creating the world in 6 days, and now Father Jamie is trying to tell me, or modern science is trying to tell me something different. Well, maybe they need not be in conflict. So are we ready? Are we sitting down for a 21st century origin story? Our kids are going off to school, and they are learning one story about our creation. In conservative places like Texas, there are all sorts of legislative movements to try to teach them creationism as well. They should know this story of how God created the world in 6 days, because otherwise, in our schools, they're learning a different story. Are you ready for that origin story? Many of us heard of the story of God creating the world in 6 days, and how it is that God created Adam and Eve, and we all come from Adam and Eve. Here's a slightly different story. First of all, as context, as we've already said, every culture has its own origin stories, its own creation myths. For some 2,500 years, we've been sharing one story, that of Adam and Eve as the center of creation in the Garden of Paradise, after God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. Those stories that Grandpa Rudy told 2,500 years ago were told in a different world. They believed that the world was flat. It's a different cosmology. They believed in a flat world with the bowl of the heavens on top of it, and maybe some sort of underworld beneath the plate on which we are currently standing. Contemporary science, though, the world in which our grandchildren and great-grandchildren are growing up, tells us a different story of our place in an immense universe, where suddenly it's not just about me, where I'm sort of like the center of the universe, but instead we have these images of the Milky Way and the Earth being a little speck in the middle of that Milky Way, and of the Milky Way being a little speck in the middle of a larger universe. It gives us a different picture. So there are differing views on creation and evolution, for instance, by those who understand the Hebrew scriptures more literally, who tend to believe that we trace the human race back to two people, Adam and Eve, some 6,000 years ago, shortly after God's sixth-day act of creation. Others tend to see the Bible as an ancient text that shares the worldviews of its authors and is not irreconcilable with contemporary science, including evolution. If our technology evolves, and if our thoughts evolve, then why can't our stories evolve as well? For the latter group, those who tend to see the lens through science, science suggests that some 99% of our human history is prehistoric, simply meaning if we as human beings, as we call ourselves Homo sapiens, we've heard that before?
Mhm.
Human beings, our genus and species, we are Homo sapiens. We've only been around about 300,000 years. For how many of those years have we been writing and able to write? For not many. For maybe 3,000 of the 30,000 years we've been writing things down, which means that for 1% of our history, we've been able to write down our history, and for the rest, we don't have written history, which is why we have to turn to things like archaeology. Archaeology, fossils, other ancient items to have an idea of who we are and where we come from. And of course, those who believe in creationism, who take the Bible really, really, really literally, how do they explain like dinosaur fossils or other ancient things? It's like God put them there to trick us. Can you believe God would do that? The earth is only 6,000 years old. So anything that you think is older than that is some sort of cruel trick. So within this more scientific worldview, the scientific consensus suggests that this iteration of the universe was created some 20 plus or minus 10 billion years ago, meaning our universe is some 10 to 30 billion years old-ish. Think about that for a moment. As the result of a big bang that led to an extremely hot, dense state that has since expanded and cooled. So the universe is currently expanding. If you watch any science shows, they talk about how it is that they, looking through the telescopes, can see the universe is expanding, which is where they get the idea of the Big Bang, because the universe expands to such a place really, really, really far, and in billions and billions years more, it's going to have reached its limit, and it's going to start contracting in on itself again, which is why I say the present iteration of this universe, because when the universe collapsed in on itself many, 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 many billions of years ago, that's what resulted in the Big Bang, was that all of that, imagine all of the matter collapsing on itself and being like concentrated, all the matter of the world concentrated on a teaspoon, right? All of that matter together is going to lead to this bang, which is what science suggests as its origin story. as its creation myth. So this act of being, yeah. When I first heard this too, Rudy's like mind blown. When I first, one of the most mind blowing courses for me at the university was I kind of wimped out from harder. I didn't study physics at the university level. I was too much of a wimp. So I studied astronomy, and that just like opened my mind. You know, when you study that the nearest star to the Earth is like 400 million light years away and could have like, it could have disappeared long time ago, and we wouldn't know yet. You know, it's just this fascinating big universe that we live in is so much more fascinating. Our ancient ancestors, for them, they didn't have the same science. So when they looked up at the stars, they were just like lights in the sky, and they didn't have a way of explaining them beyond that. For them, they could look at the stars and say, "Oh, those are the souls of our rulers and ancestors who've gone before us, who are looking down on us."
Chasing the star.
Yeah. So our Earth, how old is the Earth then? If the universe is some scientists date the universe to about 13.8 billion years ago. The Milky Way dates to about 13.6 billion years ago. The Earth dates to about 4.5 plus or minus 0.05 years ago, meaning about 4.5 billion years ago. And then, so essentially, so far the history that we're talking about, much of it's prehistory, meaning there was no one writing about history until the last 3,000 years. So a lot of our knowledge is just being recorded now during these last years and is now readily shared. I don't know about y'all. Remember when I was a child, I had to go to a library and you looked up books like with a card catalog. I mean, think about how far we've come just in our own lifetimes. When I was a child, if you wanted to make a phone call, you went to that wall over there and you dial the number on the rotary phone. And when you left the house, you didn't have access to other people until you got home. We didn't have answering machines.
But Father, even before that, if you were on a party line, there was an operator who would actually, connect you with whomever you wanted to talk to.
So we've seen all of this evolution in technology during our lifetimes. What a fascinating thing that many of our religious beliefs or many of our ways of thinking about various things haven't evolved so much. Much of what we know about ancient prehistory is through archaeological artifacts. For instance, we know that there are stone tools. We found stone tools that date to 3.3 million years ago. Think about that for a moment. That we find ancient stone tools that can be carbon dated to 3.3 million years ago. There was some evolving species that could use stone tools 3 million years ago, long before we could write and reason like we do. Hand axes date to about 1.75 million years ago. 1.75 million years ago, some ancient ancestors of ours figured out how to pull together an axe with a stick and a stone tied to it. About 400,000 years ago, that we have the first spears. Spears were a great invention because with an axe, I had to get close to the saber-toothed tiger to kill it. But now, 400,000 years ago, now that I've invented a spear, what can I do with the spear? I can have a chance at that saber-toothed tiger without getting too close. And finally, with inventions like this, 400,000 years ago, this allows us to start evolving more quickly, because what's happening before is that every time the saber-toothed tiger came upon me, I had no chance with my little hand axe. But now that everyone in the village is armed with a spear, now we start having a chance. And so with the evolution of Homo sapiens some 300,000 years ago, that's going to be this first species that can really start multiplying throughout the earth in a big way that our ancient ancestors, all these other hominids and ancient peoples couldn't. Barbed bones for spear fishing. The first ones of those we find dating to about 90,000 years ago. So we've been fishing for about 90,000 years. And when we're able to do things like this, when we're able to start killing animals, whether that's fish or saber-toothed tigers or rabbits or anything, then suddenly we have an easier way to sustain ourselves, our families, our community. The other way that we know about prehistory before anything was written is through fossils. And so now in number 18, I just list what it is that various scientists have told us. Archaeologists, as they're exploring fossils, they start telling us about what it is that they find in these various archaeological sites, because some of them are Homo sapiens like us. Others have different skulls and different body types from us and are buried with different objects, which tell us something about our ancestors. Some of the earliest fossils that we found are Sahelanthropus. The earliest hominid dates to about 7 million years ago. This is a very different story from Adam and Eve, but this would be Africa, about 7 million years ago. The Auroran fossils date to about 6 million years ago in Kenya. A lot of these, there's in a specific area because we find fossils of them in a place or two, but then we don't find anything else outside of that, or at least we haven't to date. They didn't survive in the same way that we have survived. Ardipithecus fossils dating to about 6 to 4 million years ago. Australopithecines, various breeds of those. You've heard of Lucy before.
Mm-hmm.
Lucy is where we see the dawn of bipeds. Biped, a fancy word for what? 2 feet. We're standing on our 2 feet. When do we start standing on our 2 legs? About 3.8 million years ago, we start standing up. Meaning, before we stood up, we weren't bipeds. Today we're bipeds. We have 2 legs that we stand up on 2 legs. Before that, we weren't standing up on 2 legs. Follow me? Yeah. With the evolution of this family then of Lucy and her Australopithecines family, we now have the first bipeds. So that, for instance, in those images of evolution, where you see the human being standing up and walking on one side, and it goes back to these more ancient animals, right? The bipeds were the first ones to be beginning to stand up. Homo habilis is important because that was the first early human ancestor that was able to use tools. Remember, we said that we had stone tools dating back to about 3.3 million years ago. Homo rudolfensis. Homo erectus was the first upright biped. Not only were we just standing on 2 legs now, but we were actually standing upright for the first time. Dang. So Grandpa Rudy, when Grandpa Rudy told stories, he was already imagining Adam and Eve as being upright because we had already evolved to being upright by then. But scientists are telling us we are finding fossils in the earth, presuming God didn't just put those fossils there to fool us, that lead us to believe that we've evolved to a very privileged place, that we didn't used to always stand upright, and we didn't always used to have the weapons that we have, right? We've not found any fossilized guns or anything because they haven't been invented yet, but we are finding fossilized stone tools and hand axes and spears, etc., dating back to certain time periods. Homo heidelbergensis was an ancestor of the Neanderthals about 800,000 years ago, went extinct about 250,000 years ago. The Homo neanderthalensis, the Neanderthals were about 430,000 years ago, went extinct about 40,000 years ago. The Denisovans, and then finally we come to the oldest Homo sapiens. The oldest Homo sapiens, we said, the fossils date back to about 300,000 years. And with Homo sapiens, for the first time, we see a species that's able to multiply and to start living throughout the world. We have human beings throughout the world now. That wasn't always the case, right? All these other ancient beings, I don't know what to call them, humanoids, pre-humans, right? They arose and they fell. They didn't survive in the same way that we've survived. And eventually, there have been two species of Homo sapiens. Our species is a lighter build that evolved some 200,000 years ago. So a beautiful story that you wouldn't expect to hear in a Bible study of how it is that our thought on who we are has evolved from the simple story of Grandpa Rudy of Adam and Eve being in a garden to, dang, if we keep digging into the earth, we find all sorts of things inside the earth that give us possible clues.
Proof.
That give us possible clues to life on earth before us, including dinosaurs, which I don't have on this timeline, but dinosaurs would be another time period.
I wonder how long a person lived as far as what we live now,
Yeah.
Shorter.
shorter.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
of all the chemicals that we eat now
Yeah.
versus what they and that nature's.
I think certainly because of modern medicine, and also the availability of food. I mean, just imagine for a moment what it would have been like to be an ancient culture in a certain place at a certain time and to have to survive a winter. You know, talk about everyone rallying together to find food. That had to have been quite the feat. And how to find food without being food, meaning, we were not at the top of the food chain. The saber-toothed tiger, I'm just making that up, but whatever other animals were at the top of the food chain until we invented a way to climb to the top of the food chain ourselves. Mark? No?
I saw
Terry Ann?
a documentary on a certain cave. I forgot what the name of it was. Over like in the Afghanistan area,
Uh-huh.
And they had found Neanderthalic bones and what have you.
Yeah.
But what struck me as very interesting is that the person doing the documentary said that we today still have teeny tiny bit of DNA from the Neanderthalic era.
So what's fascinating is that scientists, when they find these ancient artifacts, if they belong to something that was living, then they can find a way to take that DNA and see if they can, find it and compare it with the DNA of other organisms. And then what a fascinating thing to think that a teeny tiny bit of our DNA comes from some of these ancient peoples. And for me, what's fascinating about this is that even 113 years ago, Aglapai and all these other people 113 years ago were already trying to help one another to sort of like hold one another by the hand and walk in this direction of accepting these new then theories of science and evolution and understanding the world. Adrian?
I was going to say that it's not listed here, but a very crude example of writing is hieroglyphics. When cavemen, I don't know where they would fall underneath this time frame, that they actually they drew animals and they drew things on caves, and that was a form of writing in itself.
Yeah.
It's a precursor to alphabets, and sounds and stuff.
And we'll come to that next time, only because what's going to happen is in this evolution of the human person, what we're going to do is we're going to start seeing things that hint to how it is that they saw the world and themselves and other animals and the divine. So the idea of God and the divine is not a modern notion. It's an ancient notion that we're going to see arose with various people. There are artifacts that archaeologists now are finding, which lead us to believe, this person was buried in this way. Or wait a minute, we've seen two skulls where the hair was cut away in the same way. That suggests a ritual, that there were early peoples who were starting to engage in rituals, and some of them for religious purposes. So this idea of the divine is something that's deeply rooted within us.
But also what I picked out from this time frame is that it can explain racism in the sense that a lot of these early forms of humans come from Africa,
Okay.
evolved, and then spread around the world.
Huh?
And when you look at someone who may be prejudiced against skin tone,
Uh-huh.
may have a problem picking up on this information because they believe that things evolved from Europe, not from Africa, based upon skin tone. It's just my hypothesis.
So there is an interesting thing about us as human beings. Psychologists call it an in-group, out-group sort of mentality or way of thinking about how we tend to look at those who look like us. I mean, look at our own family, ancient peoples, right? Oh, I'm in a family that looks like me, and now another family is coming toward us that looks very different. Oh, they are different from us. We start distinguishing us from them, and physical characteristics are one way that we've tended to distinguish ourselves from other people. And
Stranger danger. I mean, we're wired for that.
stranger danger, right?
Mm-hmm.
It creates this fascinating dynamic for us where, for instance, those who take the Bible more literally, for all of us who descend from one couple, Adam and Eve, 6,000 years ago, you've got a challenge, buddy, explaining to me how it is that we look so different. Oh, that's where Grandpa Rudy came up with the stories, though, of the different peoples being similar to us, but very different from us. Follow me? Right? Oh, they descended from Abraham's firstborn son, Ishmael, whereas we descended from his secondborn. All right, let me get the names. It's already 9:00. What I propose that we pause right here. What we're going to do is we're going to flash through the upcoming parts of it. We're going to get to these parts of our independent Catholic history, but by the time we get to these, we will have understood them in the context of world religions and the Jewish Christian context from which Jesus came, which led to the rise of Christianity and the Catholic Church that we are so proud to be part of. Last words? Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and forever shall be, a world without end. Amen.